The Collaboration, Chapter 6, Witch Dawn, Part 4. The OWI was especially enthusiastic about a third film called Once Upon a Honeymoon, RKO, which starred Cary Grant and Ginger Rogers. This was a comedy about an American woman named Katie O'Hara, Ginger Rogers, who was living in Vienna and pretending to be an aristocrat so that she could marry a wealthy Austrian, Baron von Leuber. When a foreign correspondent named Pat O'Toole, Cary Grant, told Katie that Baron von Leuber was a member of Hitler's inner circle, she at first refused to believe him, but she eventually realized that he was right. She then traveled with him throughout war-torn Europe, where they witnessed all sorts of atrocities, and finally they returned home to the United States. In the official report, the OWI reviewers explained just what made Once Upon a Honeymoon so distinctive. Like other anti-Nazi movies, they said this film showed terrible German aggression and the defeat of one country after another. But the film also showed something else: the Nazis' special oppression of the Jewish people. According to the report, an attempt is made to show the cruelty and unreasonableness of minority discrimination. The Jewish problem is brought out with extreme frankness, and in two important instances, the full terror and pathos of the plight of these tragic people is depicted. The OWI reviewers went on to describe these two instances. In the first, Katie O'Hara was in her hotel room in Warsaw during the German occupation of Poland. Her chambermaid entered the room with two children and announced that the Germans were going to take them away. "We are Jewish," the chambermaid explained. Katie reacted quickly. She put a photo of the chambermaid in her own passport, and she noted down the names of the two children. She then exchanged passports with the chambermaid, and she escorted the family to a truck that was about to leave the country. "Go somewhere where it's safe," she said as the truck pulled away. "Where?" the chambermaid replied. A few days later, Katie and Pat, the American reporter, were wandering the streets of Warsaw. They were stopped by two Gestapo officers, and after a brief search, the passport of the Jewish chambermaid was found. As a result, they were thrown in a concentration camp. And a cantor sang a prayer in the background. "We're really in a mess, aren't we?" Katie said. Pat replied, "What about these people?" Then, for a minute, the characters sat in silence, and in the words of the OWI, they and we get the full impact of the suffering and terror experienced by thousands of these unfortunate people throughout Europe. The concentration camp scene in Once Upon a Honeymoon was unprecedented in American cinema, and the OWI reviewers strongly approved of it. "The above portions of the film are immensely effective," they wrote, "and the film deserves great commendation for its treatment of this important problem." But the report did not end here. The film, they said, also contained a couple scenes that threatened to undo all this good work. They proceeded to explain what they meant. They began with the first scene, which occurred immediately before Katie and Pat were interned to the concentration camp. The two Gestapo officers had just discovered the passport of the Jewish chambermaid, and one of them read out the name: Anna Sarah Beckstein, Juden. The officer then turned to Pat. "Und Sie sind der Jude Beckstein?" He asked, "And are you the Jew, Beckstein?" Pat, of course, said no. That was when the German officer came up with an idea. He noticed a derby hat hanging on the wall behind him, and he remembered the popular stereotype of the Jewish performer who wore a derby hat crammed down over his ears, and who waved his arms about in an exaggerated manner. The German officer decided to put the stereotype to a test. According to the stage directions, Trooper jams derby on Pat's head, pushes his ears down, hits hat down. Katie puts hand to mouth, starts to laugh. Pat stares at her, waving his hands, trying to explain. Katie, going into hysterics, doubles up laughing. This routine went on for some time until Katie, who had been laughing so hard that she had just been unable to speak, finally looked up at Pat and said, "Why don't you just give yourself up?" Once Upon a Honeymoon contained another scene that was no less offensive. Toward the end of the film, Pat gave a radio broadcast in which he told a few stories about the chief villain, Baron von Leuber. He ended by pointing out that von Leuber had married a Jew. He then called Katie over to the microphone and she started to speak. Then Katie spoke in a Jewish accent. "Hello, how do you do?" Moves on in a rather Semitic-looking German woman. "By any chance is your name Kaplan?" Moves on among people. "Are you all getting enough to eat? If the Baron had only told me." the schmealo. I could have made the blinzes. Of course. I don't make 'em like my mama. My sweet soft mama. Catzella. She'd always call me Catzella. Catzella, darling. Sit down. Bim table in 2 seconds I'll fix you some knishes. Believe me, you're positively gonged at lick by your fingers. And a potato lotkis. My sweet mama would say, is mine patata lotkis simply gorgeous or not? The OWI reviewers were concerned about the above two scenes, and they wrote about the studio in question, RKO. They accepted RKO's assurances that the director of the film, Leo McCarey, had always gone to great lengths to avoid anything in bad taste. They also accepted that the scenes had occasioned much laughter among previous audiences. Nevertheless, they said, if there is any chance that the scenes may be misinterpreted or cause bitterness among our Jewish population, they would better be omitted. The recommendation was taken seriously. In the final cut of the film, there is no trace of either of the offensive scenes. The OWI's record with respect to the Jewish question, therefore, was impressive. The organization encouraged the studios to expose the persecution of the Jews and discouraged offense or demeaning stereotypes. The record of the studios themselves, however, was quite another matter. In the period stemming from America's entry into the war in December 1941 to Franklin D. Roosevelt's creation of a War Refugee Board in January 1944, the studios released one other picture that mentioned the Jews in Germany, Hitler's Children, and one other that mentioned Jews at Bataan. There were hundreds of anti-Nazi films, of course, films that gave audiences the impression that Hollywood was a bastion of democracy, but with respect to the persecution of the Jews, there were a few brief references in The Pied Piper and Margin for Error, and the 2-minute concentration camp scene in Once Upon a Honeymoon. The reason for this reticence was clear. After a decade of training themselves to avoid any mention of Jews in their films, the studio heads were simply not ready to engage in what they understood as special pleading. The years of collaboration with Nazi Germany had marked them too deeply. The German market was closed now, and the United States had entered the war. But the heads of the Hollywood studios, most of whom were Jews themselves, were unwilling to say anything about the plight of the Jews in Europe. And yet, despite their best efforts, they could never have prevented what came next. Out of their own empire, there suddenly emerged a new kind of voice, one that can only have emerged in this particular time and place. The voice which provided a corrective to their silence, and which questioned their whole attitude toward their Jewishness, belonged to one of the most valued employees, the prolific screenwriter, Ben Hecht. Hecht had been born in New York City in 1894 to Jewish immigrant parents, and by the age of 17 he had already become an established reporter for the Chicago Daily News. In 1924, he had moved back to New York to write books and short stories, and soon afterward he had found himself in financial difficulties. Then, at least according to his version of the story, one spring day in 1925, a telegram had arrived from his friend Herman Mankiewicz. Will you accept $300 per week to work for Paramount Pictures? All expenses paid. The $300 is peanuts. Millions are to be grabbed out here, and your only competition is idiots. Don't let this get around. Heck accepted the offer, and he quickly became one of the highest paid writers in Hollywood. He received the first ever Academy Award for Best Story for his gangster picture Underworld, 1927, and he went on to write classics such as Scarface, 1932, Design for Living, 1933, Viva Villa, 1934, Nothing Sacred, 1937, and His Girl Friday, 1940. In total, he wrote nearly 100 screenplays, many of which churned out in a matter of days. One of his favorite boasts was that he had written the final script of Gone with the Wind in a week, without actually having read the book. Despite this stunning record, Hecht had little respect for the movies, mainly because he felt his own work was constantly being butchered at the last moment. He frequently lost his temper about this, and on several occasions he complained to the producer in question. One of his letters was to Samuel Goldwyn in 1938 was particularly brutal. The wanton and amateur rewriting of the last half of the material I gave you, the idiot sabotage plays with my lines, scenes, and plot points, the totally psychopathic mania for change. All these items make it impossible for me to ever write anything for you. Your use or discarding. I'm sorry to start rabbit punching, Sam, because outside of your lack of respect for my work and your curious urge to change, lessen, and debauch it, I found you charming and pleasing to be with and work for. Allow me to walk out with nothing more offensive than a pout, a sigh, and a friendly never again. Good luck. Although Hecht rarely kept such promises, he was back working for Goldwyn the following year. The above letter made one thing clear. He had guts. He could stand up to anyone, even the person who paid his salary. And in November 1938, after hearing about the brutal pogroms against the Jews on Kristallnacht, he found himself standing up for a political cause for the first time in his life. The news from Germany transformed him. Well, until he heard it, he later explained, he never really considered himself a Jew. Now he looked upon the world with Jewish eyes, and he spoke out against whatever the Germans were doing. No such urgent decision, he said, has ever commanded me before.